For people who love the outdoors, Alaska is paradise. For Robert Hansen, it was a place where he could parlay his love for hunting into a more dangerous game where no one could hear his victims scream. For more than a decade, he hunted women for sport. Like literally hunted. Naked and scared, they were told to run for their lives through the Alaskan wilderness. Armed with a knife and a rifle, he tracked them, he hunted them, and he buried them in shallow graves along the river. He took their precious possessions as trophies until one brave 17-year-old took him down. Good to see you. I'm Amy, and this is True Crime Recaps. This is where you're going to get all the crime in half the time. I want to take you back to July 1980 in Seward, Alaska. Temperatures were in the mid-50s, the daylight stretched past 18 hours, and the tourists were pouring in to explore the area's national parks and glaciers. It was, for all intents and purposes, shaping up to be a picturesque summer until the body of 24-year-old Joanne Messina was discovered in a gravel pit along the scenic Seward Highway, partially eaten by bears. A couple of weeks later, outside of Anchorage, 3 hours north, a construction crew working on a string of power lines on Eklutna Road discovered the skeletal remains of another woman resting in a shallow grave dug into the Alaskan wilderness about a mile off the road. The frayed and decaying fabric of her clothes still clung to her partially decomposed bones. Without knowing her name, investigators dubbed her Eklutna Annie. She'd been killed by a single stab wound to the chest. So what followed over the next 3 years was a series of chilling discoveries and dead ends. More women, dancers, and sex workers from across Anchorage disappeared and later turned up dead in the forests surrounding the city. The first break in the case came thanks to the fierce determination of a 17-year-old sex worker named Cindy Paulson. She managed to escape her captor and put police on the trail of Alaska's most prolific serial killer, mild-mannered family man Robert Hansen. Now let me tell you a little bit about Bob. He was an only child. He was born on February 15th, 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, and his early years could have been pulled from a serial killer handbook. He was shy and he struggled with severe acne and a pronounced stutter, making him a prime target for bullies. And the girls shunned him, sparking his deep-seated hatred of women. His life at home wasn't much better than at school. His father was a strict man with a heavy hand when it came to disciplining his only child. He was a successful baker, and Bob was expected to learn the family trade. His mother was equally as strict and extremely religious, two character traits almost guaranteed to mess you up. To cope, he turned to the outdoors for comfort, and he got good at hunting, fishing, and archery, skills that he would later put to heinous use. After graduating from high school, he enlisted in the Army Reserves, and during basic training, he lost his virginity to a sex worker in New York City. The whole encounter was less than ideal, and it only made his disdain for women worse, especially now he had a special hatred for sex workers. After a couple of years in the Army, he came home and he went back to work in his father's bakery, but he didn't lose himself outdoors like he did growing up. He served as a volunteer firefighter, and he was in charge of training the new recruits, and he met a nice girl. One thing led to another, which led to romance, and they were married in 1960. That same year, Bob said "I do" to revenge. He burned down a school bus garage to get back at the driver who let the kids pick on him while he was a student there. He would have gotten away with it if his accomplice, a 16-year-old boy who helped out at his father's bakery, hadn't turned him in. He got 3 years in prison for arson and divorce papers from his humiliated wife. While he was behind bars, he underwent a psychiatric assessment. The diagnosis? Infantile personality disorder, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. He was a big, mean baby. Over the next few years, he bounced from bakery to bakery around the Midwest and eventually landed in Minneapolis, where he remarried in 1963. He was 24. Unfortunately, he wasn't the friendly neighborhood baker his second wife, Darla, thought he was. he developed into a kleptomaniac. It became so much of a problem, he had to hide the stolen loot at his job so his wife wouldn't find out what he was doing. Now, 2 years after their wedding, he was arrested again. This time, it was for stealing fishing lines and lures. He tried to keep it from his wife by calling his boss to bail him out, but she found out and persuaded their Lutheran pastor to intervene, and he successfully argued to have the charges dropped. But Bob didn't go straight. He was arrested again later that year for stealing a softball. Soon after, his wife was set to graduate from college, and the couple decided it was time to move on from Minnesota. So they both loved the outdoors, so they decided to relocate to Alaska. They settled in the Anchorage area in August of 1967, and they found jobs almost right away. Robert got work as a baker, and his wife took a position teaching special needs children. They had 2 kids and appeared to be the perfect family. Bob was a pillar of the community, known around town for his delicious baked goods and his hunting prowess. He was such a skilled outdoorsman, he even set local and national records for bow hunting. For 3 years running, his big game kills made the Pope and Young record book. He started hanging the heads of his kills as trophies in his den to show off to friends. It wasn't long, however, before he began to crave a bigger challenge, and he started collecting other kinds of trophies. Bob's favorite sport was to lure working girls off the street corner and into his car with the promise of cash. He looked so totally average and harmless, they never thought twice about hopping in. But once the door shut behind them, he took control immediately, yanking their hair back and pressing a gun into their side as he drove them to either his house or his remote hunting cabin, where he would torture and rape them. From there, he loaded them into his plane and flew to his favorite hunting grounds, the Nick River northeast of Anchorage, where he would land on a sandbar and release his captive into the wild. But this was no act of mercy. It was a game. He liked to give them a head start to make it even more fun for him. And as they ran for their lives, he hunted them with his rifle and a knife. No one ever made it out to Nick River and lived. He buried them in the sandbar and marked the location of their graves on a map he kept hidden behind his headboard at home. When he captured Cindy Paulson, he had already hunted and killed at least 17 women. She was the only one who managed to escape the deadly flight. Cindy was just another bad girl to Robert, a sex worker he could act out his intense hatred on. She was taken just like the others, and after the torture and assault, he drove her to his plane at the local airstrip, Merrill Field. While he was loading the cockpit, though, she saw an opportunity to run, and he chased her to the street. But when she flagged down a passing truck, he was forced to give up and drive away. The truck driver was startled and confused to see this disheveled teenager with no shoes and cuffed hands running and screaming through the street. She told police later that she left her shoes in the back seat of Bob's car intentionally to prove she was there. She told police he had kept her chained by the neck to a pole in his basement before taking her to the airstrip. And she was not only able to identify him by name because he'd given her his real name, but she'd memorized the tail number of his plane. And when they questioned Bob, he denied any and all wrongdoing. He admitted that, they'd met. He had to explain how she knew his name somehow. But he claimed that she tried to shake him down for more money, and he refused. Eventually, they cleared him and they let him go. And get this, that wasn't even the first time a woman had accused him of kidnapping, rape, and torture. So 12 years earlier, in late December 1971, he was arrested for the kidnapping and rape of Barbara Fields. He took her from a cafe parking lot, bound her wrist behind her back, drove to a motel where he tied her up and assaulted her, and then he wrote down information about her and her parents to use against her if she went to the police. Then he drove her back into town, dropped her off a block from the cafe, and disappeared into the night. Incredibly, Barbara's father was a police officer, and she told him what happened, but she didn't give him a description because of Bob's threats. However, a few days later, on Christmas Day, the half-dressed, frozen body of Celia Van Zanten was discovered. Her hands were bound behind her back. She'd been reported missing 2 days earlier. So when Barbara read about that in the papers, she went to the police to press formal charges, and Bob was arrested. However, he was able to convincingly fake a severe dissociative disorder and claim he didn't remember what happened to Barbara. To Celia, he denied everything. Shockingly, though, the ruse worked, and he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison for the attack on Barbara. Plus, it was recommended that he be allowed work release as soon as possible to help support his family. So he served just 3 months, and he was sent to a halfway house for the remainder of his sentence so he could go to and from work. He also got psychiatric treatment for a disease that he didn't even have, and he spent the entire time thinking about how he could become a better killer. He couldn't wait to do it again. As fate would have it, Alaska was blooming into the perfect hunting ground for killers like him. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was being built, and with that massive project came construction labor from across the country. And with construction labor came the girls. It was a lot like the gold rush. With all the new arrivals, there's a huge bustling business in strip clubs and sex workers. And with so many new people coming in and out of town, it was easy for people to just go missing and stay unreported. 2 of those people were Eklutna Annie and Joanne Messina. They were killed before Bob got the idea to start hunting his captives. As more and more bodies started turning up, though, in and around the Nick River area, investigators started to suspect that the same person was behind all of those bodies, as well as the murders from the mid-70s. So without any other leads, they reached out to the FBI and Special Agent John Douglas for a psychological profile to help them catch the killer. Now, you might remember Agent Douglas from Netflix's Mindhunter, and if you saw that show, you know that the term serial killer was still relatively new at the time, and there weren't all that many known to police. They were far out of their comfort zone with Bob. But the profile proved to be amazingly accurate. They theorized that the suspect was probably around 40 years old and a thrill killer who may be a stutterer. He's probably an upstanding, respected member of the community who was rejected as a kid and is probably above average intelligence. Now, they couldn't prove Bob had kidnapped and raped Cindy, but they managed to dig up something else to charge him with. It turned out that he had committed insurance fraud. He claimed that several of his prized animal trophies worth $13,000 had been stolen when they had it, and he used that money to open up his own bakery in a mini mall in downtown Anchorage. Now, this gave the police all the ammunition they needed to get search warrants. On October 27, 1983, they caught up with him at work and asked him to come in and answer a few questions. He agreed to go, didn't ask why. At the same time, they were serving search warrants at his home and at the airstrip where his plane was. They found a cache of guns, something he wasn't supposed to own as a felon, but nothing that tied him to any crimes. So they were about to leave when one officer found a hidden space in the attic. This proved to be the gold mine they were looking for. Hidden inside were several pieces of jewelry that matched some of the victims' known possessions at the time that they went missing. There were also ID cards of the murdered women, and the most incriminating, a .223 caliber Mini 14 rifle. Behind the headboard of his bed, they found an aeronautical map that's used by pilots, but this map was covered with 24 X's. 4 of them matched the places where the bodies of Eklutna Annie, Joanne Messina, Sherry Morrow, and Paula Golding had been found. Presented with the mountain of evidence and the ballistic confirmation that shell casings found at the various graves all matched his rifle, Bob confessed to murdering the 4 women they already knew about. As part of his plea agreement, prosecutors agreed to only charge him with those 4 known victims and send him to federal prison instead of a maximum security facility in exchange for his cooperation in the other missing dancer cases, and as long as he would identify the bodies that went with the marks on his map. So he agreed and confessed to the kidnapping and murder of 17 women, as well as assaulting at least 30 more. Of the 17 he confessed to, only 12 were ever found. Sometimes the police would fly him in a helicopter to the site so he could help them find the graves. And once, when he recognized the scenery from the air, he got visibly excited and started gleefully describing what he had done to his victim. When they landed, he made a beeline into the trees, and police had to struggle to keep up. When they caught up with the serial killer, They found him on his hands and knees, still cuffed and shackled, shoveling snow with his bare hands, a wide grin stretching from ear to ear. Today, Cindy Paulson is married with kids and still living in Alaska. Thanks to her, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison. He died there in 2014 of natural causes at 75 years old. To this day, there are still marks on his map that have never been identified, and police think he probably killed dozens more than he admitted to. The victims we know about include Roxanne Eastland, Mele Larson, Sue Luna, Delynn Frey, Teresa Watson, Angela Federin, Tamara Pedersen, Lisa Futrell, Andrea Altieri, and Robin Pelkey, who just got her name back in October of 2021, because up to then, she was known as Horseshoe Harriet. But many of them, like E. Cluton and Annie, have never been found or named. Thanks for watching and spending some time with me today. It would mean so much to us if you would give this a like and hit subscribe and the bell so we can make this a regular thing. Chris and I are here every week with new recaps. Hope to see you next time. Until then, take care.